On the 15th of April 1989, 54,000 people attended the FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest, which was held at Sheffield Wednesday's football ground, Hillsborough. 96 men, women and children who went there to support Liverpool died in a lethal crush on the Leppings Lane terrace. 400 more were taken to hospital with injuries. After a 26-year fight for justice by the victims' families, the South Yorkshire police officer in charge, Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield, admitted at the new inquest into the disaster that his serious failings caused the deaths and injuries. But at the time, even as people were dying in the central pens of the terrace, Duckenfield lied and said that Liverpool supporters had gained unauthorised entry via an exit gate. In fact, he had ordered it to be opened. The police had to correct that lie, but it nevertheless started a story which the South Yorkshire Police told to the media and official legal procedures which followed, that the people who had suffered themselves were drunken hooligans who were to blame for the disaster. The new inquests, ordered after the first inquest was finally quashed in December 2012, started in Warrington in March 2014 and have become by far the longest case heard by a jury in British legal history. A huge volume of evidence has been heard about the disaster and about the decisions South Yorkshire Police made, leading to the appointment 19 days before the semi-final of Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield, who had never commanded a match at Hillsborough before. Wright's removal of Chief Superintendent Mole followed the disciplining of 8 other officers for an excessive prank they played on a probationary constable in October 1988. The official reason for Mole's move to Barnsley was that it was career development, but he was an expert at football policing and had commanded the semi-finals at Hillsborough in 1987 and 1988, which was also between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. If the move was for career development, the inquests heard no explanation about why it was so soon before the semi-final, where the senior officer was responsible for the safety of 54,000 people. Duckenfield, a known disciplinarian, had policed in Sheffield city centre, but had not even been on duty at Hillsborough for 10 years when Peter Wright promoted him to replace Mole and take command of the match. Mole had had a detailed knowledge of Hillsborough, including the Leppings Lane turnstiles, which was allocated as the end for Liverpool supporters. The approach was a narrow bottleneck, along which 10,100 people had to be funnelled in through just 7 turnstiles. In major admissions at the new inquests, Duckenfield confessed that he failed to do basic preparation for the semi-final. He did not even visit the ground before signing off the police's operational plan, and he failed to read relevant safety documents. He admitted he knew very little of the ground's safety history, that there had been crushes at the 1988 and 1981 semi-finals, and he was unaware of the basic layout of the Leppings Lane end. That included a large tunnel facing the turnstiles, which led people down into the central pens of the terrace. Duckenfield did not even know that the police were responsible for monitoring the numbers of people in each pen, and he admitted that his focus before the match was solely on dealing with misbehaviour. He did not consider the need to protect people from overcrowding or crushing. Nor did he know that the police had a tactic, named after a superintendent, John Freeman, of closing the tunnel when the central pens were full and directing arriving supporters to the side pens.
There's gaps, you know, in parts of the ground. Well, you look at the Liverpool end to the right of the goal. There's hardly anybody on those steps.
Having failed to prepare, Duckenfield admitted when he gave evidence 26 years later, he failed profoundly at the match itself. Mole would be taken by a driver all over Sheffield in the hours before a match to check on arrivals and trouble spots. Then he would patrol around the ground leading up to the 3 p.m. kick-off, talking to his officers, particularly at known difficult areas including Leppings Lane. Duckenfield has never been able to account for what he did in more than 2 hours between briefing officers and arriving in the control box at 2 p.m. Once he was in the small control room which looked right over the Leppings Lane terrace, he stayed rooted in it. Superintendent Roger Marshall, who was put in charge outside, was new to the role. He didn't stagger people's approach to the Leppings Lane turnstiles using police horses or cordons to direct them into queues. The thousands of people arriving to support Liverpool walked into the bottleneck, and the 7 turnstiles were not adequate to allow them through quickly. Marshall told the new inquest it was one of his most profound regrets that he did not ask for the 3 p.m. kick-off to be delayed, which would have relieved the pressure of people anxious to be in for the start. He conceded that he did not give any orders to alleviate the developing crisis outside, and as more people continued to arrive, the congestion compacted into a dangerous crush. Marshall admitted that the police had no control of the area, and he began to fear that somebody could die outside. He then radioed the control box to ask for the large exit gate, Gate C, to be opened, to allow a large group of people in and alleviate the crush outside. At 2:52 p.m, Duckenfield, who was asked 3 times, finally ordered Gate C to be opened, and 2,000 people were directed by police officers to go through at once. They included 30 who went into the central pens, were carried by the pressure of the crowd to the front within minutes, and were among the 96 people who died. Duckenfield admitted that when he ordered the gate to be opened, he gave no thought to where the people would go once they had been guided in. He didn't foresee that they would go down the tunnel facing them. He didn't order any police officers inside to direct the incoming people away from the central pens, round to the sides where there was still room. In detailed medical evidence, the inquest heard that the victims suffered compression asphyxia, causing their hearts to stop because the crush in the central pens was so fierce they could not expand their chests to breathe. Survivors of the crush gave graphic evidence about being unable to help people who were dying around them, some people about passing out themselves, and about the terror of being trapped. The police and ambulance service were slow and disorganised in their response to the emergency the inquests heard, although some individual officers made great efforts to help. Among the Liverpool fans were doctors, nurses, off-duty police officers and firemen, and many people with no medical training at all, who in the chaos tried to save people.
I know that the decision was taken to open the gate. I know it was a considered decision on the basis of what could be seen.
Under repeated questioning, Duckenfield admitted in his evidence that when he failed to foresee where people would go when he opened the gate, he froze, and he acknowledged that his failure to close the tunnel was the direct cause of the deaths of the 96 people at Hillsborough. At the time, though, he did not admit that, and neither did South Yorkshire Police. At 3:15 p.m, even as people were dying, Duckenfield told Graham Kelly, the Secretary of the Football Association, that Liverpool fans had gained unauthorised entry through the exit gate.
There are 2 versions of what went wrong. The first is that a door or doors was forced down. The second is that a door or doors was or were opened by someone in authority.
Peter Wright had to correct the lie later that evening, but Wright himself personally oversaw his force's campaign which followed, to deny any failings and to allege that the disaster was caused by many Liverpool supporters having been drunk and arriving at the match late and without tickets. The head of CID, Terence Addis, had set up the Hillsborough gymnasium where the dead bodies had been taken as his incident room for the investigation. Devastated families had to identify their dead relatives, and they were then immediately quizzed by detectives about how much the victims had had to drink. At 2 minutes to 6, the inquest heard, an inspector, Gordon Sykes, sent a police photographer out to take pictures of the litter at the turnstiles to, as Sykes put it, gather evidence of what had happened. That night, with hundreds of people in hospital and distraught families searching for missing relatives or being given the dreadful news, many South Yorkshire police officers went to their social club, the Niagara, where they themselves had a drink. There, some spread the stories of drunkenness and worse, most notoriously published that week in The Sun. The following morning, the Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, arrived at Hillsborough and was told by police that the disaster had been caused by a tanked-up mob of supporters. At the official inquiry by Lord Justice Taylor, the South Yorkshire Police case was to blame supporters, but Taylor found against them. He identified Duckenfield's inexperience and judged that police mismanagement had caused the disaster, and he criticised the South Yorkshire Police for mounting the case against the supporters. But at the first inquest, which started in Sheffield in November 1990, the force made that case again. The bereaved families always protested against the prominence given to the allegations and against the verdict in March 1991 of accidental death. 6 years later, it emerged that the force had amended 164 officers' accounts of the disaster before they were sent to the Taylor inquiry, removing criticisms of the police operation and of senior officers, and all mentions of the Freeman tactic of closing off the tunnel to the central pens. Yet Lord Justice Stuart Smith, who conducted a scrutiny, did not recommend any new justice process. The families campaigned for another decade, before in 2009, the then Labour ministers Andy Burnham and Maria Eagle called for all documents held by the police and other bodies to be released. 3 years later, the Hillsborough Independent Panel produced a landmark report which emphatically exposed the scale of police failings and the campaign to blame supporters, and led to the first inquest being quashed. Finally, after 27 years, the new inquests in Warrington have vindicated the family's long, traumatic fight for justice and delivered a verdict that the 96 people were unlawfully killed due to the failures of South Yorkshire Police.